Hey guys, so I'm posting again because I realized after going back and reading through some of your discussion posts that I actually talked about one of the wrong amendments. So the Sixth Amendment is important, but the instructions actually indicated that we talk about one of three, so either the first or the second or the 10th. So I'm going to go ahead and talk again tonight, and this time I'm going to talk about the First Amendment in the hopes that that actually meets course expectations. So the First Amendment was actually an integral part of the Bill of Rights, and probably one of the reasons why the Anti-Federalists were so adamant that a Bill of Rights be added to the Constitution, because they were afraid that the Constitution did not inherently protect the rights of the people. And you often hear the First Amendment expressed as the 5 freedoms, so freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to petition, and the freedom of religion. Of those, probably the one that was the most revolutionary, to use a word, at the time was going to be freedom of religion, which James Madison, in writing the Bill of Rights, derived from Thomas Jefferson's Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. As I mentioned last week, Thomas Jefferson saw that little paragraph, it's really only about 2 or 3 really long run-on sentences, as a critical part of his time on Earth, so much so that he makes it a part of his tombstone, one of the 3 things that he wants to be remembered for on his tombstone. And historically, the 5 Freedoms Amendment is the one that high schoolers and college students and even middle schoolers probably know. You'll often hear, as a teacher, I often hear students quoting about their rights and their First Amendment rights and the things that they have the right to in school. And we have to remind them that you have to draw the line somewhere at school, and that their rights aren't just adamantly across the board. But it is an important part of the American lifestyle and American tradition. Probably the ones that can be highlighted the most easily or the most frequently are going to be freedom of speech cases, most significantly in Tinker versus Des Moines, where a decision was made during the Vietnam War era that students could, in school, silently protest the Vietnam War by wearing a black armband. And then more recently, as I said, it pops up pretty frequently for in other situations or more frequently in other Supreme Court cases in current events. More specifically, this past year, the Supreme Court decided on a case, Minnesota Voters Alliance versus Mansky, and that had to do with actually campaign buttons of all things. And Minnesota was drawing a line around polling places and saying what people could or could not wear there. And normally you see that. I know here in Virginia, there is a limit to how close you're able to get to polling places, to place signs outside of polling places, to campaign outside of polling places. But the Supreme Court actually ruled in the favor of the Voters Alliance because they determined that Minnesota was actually drawing the line too broadly, and that they were actually limiting freedom of speech in order to try to assert kind of vigilance over the polling place. So in conclusion, the First Amendment from really the time of the founders has been one of the most frequently quoted, frequently used, and frequently protected. It will come up with John Adams' Alien and Sedition Acts in the 1790s, when John Adams is accused of violating the First Amendment in order to prevent newspapers from speaking cruelly about the government. It will come up in Abraham Lincoln's suspension of the writ of habeas corpus during the Civil War, and all of these things that limit, or that arguably are decisions over limiting what people can and cannot do, and whether or not their 5 inherent rights are protected under the U.S. Constitution. Thanks.